The man who would become known throughout Mississippi as the Giant arrived at Riverside Plantation in chains on September 12, 1852, purchased from New Orleans slave market for extraordinary sum of $2.800, price that reflected not merely his obvious physical strength, but more significantly his intimidating size that made him unlike any enslaved person that plantation owner Marcus Thornton had ever encountered during 30 years of managing cotton operations that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually through brutal exploitation of enslaved labor, whose mortality rates exceeded those typical, even in region notorious for working people. Later death and replacing them through continuous purchases from domestic slave traders operating throughout Deep South. The physical dimensions that justified this premium price were staggering even by standards of era, when manual agricultural labor selected for workers of exceptional strength and endurance. The man stood approximately 7 feet 2 inches tall, according to measurements recorded in plantation ledgers, weighed over 350 pounds, according to estimates from people who observed him during initial processing at Riverside, and possessed musculature so pronounced that witnesses consistently described him as resembling classical statues of mythological heroes whose proportions exceeded normal human scale and suggested divine or supernatural origins that challenged comfortable assumptions about biological determinism and racial hierarchy that white supremacy employed to justify enslavement of African peoples. Subscribe now, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. This giant story will shatter everything you thought about slavery's power. The name recorded in Marcus Thornton's purchase documents and in plantation ledgers that tracked enslaved workers' assignments, productivity, and disciplinary incidents was simply Goliath, name that previous owner in New Orleans had assigned with obvious biblical reference to giant Philistine warrior who had terrorized Israelite army before being slain by young shepherd David through combination of cunning, divine favor, and projectile weapon that allowed smaller combatant to defeat larger opponent without engaging in direct physical confrontation where size and strength would have determined outcome. The name was meant to be simultaneously descriptive of physical reality, the enslaved man's extraordinary height and build that made giant accurate characterization rather than mere hyperbole, and symbolically diminishing through suggestion that despite intimidating physical presence, this person remained vulnerable to defeat by smaller but cleverer opponents who could exploit weaknesses or employ indirect methods of control that would neutralize advantages conveyed by superior size and strength. The layered meanings embedded in name Goliath reflected white anxiety about enslaved person whose physical capabilities challenged comforting fiction that white authority derived from natural superiority rather than from legal systems and military power that could theoretically be overwhelmed if enslaved people ever decided collectively to employ their strength toward liberation rather than toward submission that slavery demanded. But the man himself, when asked years later by people who knew him after he achieved freedom, when asked what name he preferred to be called, when asked about identity that existed beneath label that white owners had imposed, would say that he had been called Kofi in language of his Ashanti ancestors, name given to him by mother who had died during Middle Passage, that brought them both from West Africa's Gold Coast to Americas in holds of slave ships whose conditions produced mortality rates approaching 40% during voyages lasting 6 to 8 weeks across Atlantic. The name Kofi, he explained, identified him as having been born on Friday, according to Ashanti naming practices that connected children to specific days of week and that embedded them within cosmological frameworks relating human lives to cyclical patterns governing natural world and spiritual realm. His mother had whispered this name to him repeatedly during those terrible weeks aboard ship, had maintained connection to cultural identity and to ancestral heritage, despite horror of captivity and despite recognition that their lives in Americas would involve systematic attempts to destroy all African cultural practices and to replace them with identities constructed by white owners whose economic interests required reducing enslaved people to interchangeable units of labor, stripped of histories, cultures, languages, and kinship networks that had structured their existence before enslavement. The preservation of name Kofi within his own consciousness, despite 17 years of white owners insisting that he respond to Goliath, represented form of resistance that many enslaved people maintained, interior identity that remained inaccessible to white authority, despite that authority's claims to total ownership of enslaved people's beings. The distinction between public identity, imposed by slavery, and private identity, maintained through memory and through cultural knowledge, transmitted orally despite prohibitions against African languages and practices, would prove crucial to understanding psychological resources that enabled Kofi to survive decades of enslavement without having his will broken, despite systematic attempts to accomplish precisely that objective through combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and social isolation, designed to make resistance appear futile and submission appear inevitable. The background that Kofi brought to Riverside Plantation in September 1852 involved approximately 18 years of enslavement across multiple locations and under multiple owners following his arrival in Americas around age 7 in 1834 aboard ship that had transported approximately 400 captives from West African coast to Charleston, South Carolina, where surviving cargo, approximately 240 people after mortality during Middle Passage, had been sold at auction to buyers throughout South who bid competitively for workers whose ages, physical conditions, and apparent temperaments suggested they would survive rigors of plantation labor and would provide years of productive service before dying from exhaustion, disease, injury, or other causes that made average life expectancy for enslaved field workers in Deep South approximately 7 years shorter than life expectancy for enslaved people working in less brutal contexts like urban domestic service or skilled trades that required preservation of workers' health to maintain economic value of specialized training. The pattern across those 18 years between Kofi's arrival in Charleston in 1834 and his purchase by Marcus Thornton in 1852 had involved him being sold 6 times, 6 different owners, across 6 different locations in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and finally Mississippi, because each owner had eventually become uncomfortable with presence of enslaved person whose physical capabilities made normal methods of discipline and control seem inadequate, and whose very existence challenged comforting assumptions about white authority deriving from natural superiority rather than from legal power, backed ultimately by military force that could be deployed if enslaved people ever collectively decided to resist systems that claim to own their bodies, their labor, their children, and even their identities as human beings deserving moral consideration and legal protection. The specific reasons for these successive sales had varied in details, but had shared common theme. Each owner had eventually concluded that economic value generated by Kofi's extraordinary labor capacity was outweighed by psychological anxiety his presence created among white overseers and among other enslaved workers who recognized that his physical strength, if ever directed toward resistance rather than toward productive labor, could inflict damage that normal plantation security measures would struggle to contain. The first sale had occurred in 1836, when South Carolina rice planter, who had purchased 7-year-old Kofi in Charleston, decided 2 years later that Boy's rapid growth and his apparent intelligence suggested he would become unmanageable as he matured into adulthood, and that preemptive sale while he was still young enough to appear controllable would avoid future problems. The second sale occurred in 1839, when Georgia cotton planter, who had purchased 9-year-old Kofi, decided 3 years later that 12-year-old who already stood 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds represented security risk whose potential value as extraordinarily productive field worker could not justify anxieties his presence created among white overseers who reported being intimidated during interactions, requiring them to discipline or correct someone whose physical superiority challenged their authority. The subsequent sales followed similar patterns through Kofi's teenage years and early 20s. Each owner would recognize his extraordinary work capacity and would initially congratulate himself on having acquired valuable property at prices that seemed justified by productivity he generated, but then over months or years would develop increasing anxiety about what might happen if this physically imposing person ever decided to stop cooperating with system that kept him in bondage and that denied him any legal recourse against arbitrary violence or systematic exploitation that characterized plantation slavery in Deep South states, where cotton cultivation dominated economies and where enslaved people's lives were calculated in purely economic terms as investments that generated returns through extraction of maximum labor during minimum time before workers died or became too injured or too sick to continue performing tasks that plantation operations required for profitability. The arrival at Riverside Plantation in September 1852 represented Marcus Thornton's calculated gamble that he possessed management skills and psychological insight sufficient to succeed where 6 previous owners had failed, that through combination of careful treatment, calibrated to avoid provoking resistance while maintaining necessary discipline, strategic use of incentives that would make cooperation appear preferable to confrontation, and willingness to accept somewhat reduced profit margins in exchange for avoiding security problems that previous owners had found unmanageable. Marcus understood from studying Kofi's history, documented in papers that accompanied his purchase, that simple brutality would not work with someone of his physical capabilities, that whippings and other punishments that produced submission in most enslaved workers might instead provoke resistance from someone whose strength made him potentially capable of killing overseers or even master himself if provoked beyond endurance level that Marcus had to identify and needed to avoid crossing if he wanted to extract economic value from this extraordinary but dangerous property he had acquired. The initial conversation that occurred between Marcus and Kofi on first day of his residence at Riverside established parameters that would govern their relationship for next 11 years until circumstances created by Civil War's progression through Mississippi would transform those parameters in ways that Marcus could not have anticipated, despite his careful planning and despite his confidence that his management approach represented improvement over simpler and more brutal methods employed by less sophisticated plantation owners who believed that unquestioned white supremacy and threat of overwhelming violence provided sufficient basis for maintaining control over enslaved populations, regardless of individuals' capabilities or psychological states. The conversation occurred in barn, where Kofi had been temporarily housed, while permanent quarters were being prepared in slave housing area, located approximately quarter-mile from main plantation house, where Marcus resided with his wife Eleanor and their 3 children, whose comfortable existence depended entirely on wealth generated through exploitation of approximately 180 enslaved people whose labor transformed Riverside's 6,000 acres of fertile Mississippi Delta soil into cotton crops, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars annually in markets where Southern cotton supplied textile mills throughout United States and throughout Europe, whose industrial development depended on cheap raw materials, produced through coerced labor systems, whose violence and whose systematic denial of human rights appeared sustainable indefinitely to white Southerners who controlled political and military institutions protecting slavery against external interference and against internal resistance. "I know your history," Marcus began, speaking in tone meant to convey authority while avoiding confrontational aggression that might provoke defensive reactions. "I've studied records from your 6 previous owners. You were sold not because you failed to work adequately, or because you damaged property, or because you attacked overseers or attempted escape. You were sold repeatedly because owners became afraid of what you might do if you ever decided to stop cooperating with system that keeps you enslaved. Each owner eventually concluded that anxiety your presence created outweighed economic value your labor generated. I want to establish clear understanding about expectations here at Riverside so we can avoid pattern that characterized your previous experiences and so we can develop arrangement that benefits us both, despite obvious fact that you would prefer freedom to enslavement and despite reality that I possess legal authority to treat you however I choose, regardless of informal understandings we might develop." Marcus paused, watching Kofi's face for reactions that might indicate how these words were being received, looking for signs of anger or resentment that might suggest confrontation was developing, looking also for signs of submission or fear that might suggest that psychological dominance could be established through assertion of authority rather than through actual violence that Marcus preferred to avoid if possible. But Kofi's expression revealed nothing. His face maintained perfect neutrality that gave no indication of his thoughts or feelings, neutrality that itself represented form of resistance because it denied Marcus access to psychological information he needed to calibrate his management approach, and because it asserted boundary between Kofi's interior life and Marcus's claims to total ownership. "Here's what I propose," Marcus continued after silence had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "You will work according to quotas I establish based on your capabilities, rather than on capabilities of average field worker. These quotas will be challenging but achievable without destroying your health or requiring you to work yourself to death within few years, as happens to many enslaved people in cotton cultivation. You will submit to discipline when your behavior genuinely warrants correction, but discipline will be proportionate to infractions and will not involve arbitrary brutality designed merely to demonstrate authority or to terrorize you into submission beyond what work requirements actually demand. You will not inspire resistance among other enslaved workers through your example or through conversations that might encourage them to question system or to consider possibilities of freedom. In exchange for your cooperation with these expectations, I will ensure you receive adequate food to maintain your strength, adequate rest to prevent exhaustion that leads to injury or illness, and treatment that recognizes your intelligence and your humanity, despite legal fiction that you are property rather than person. I believe this arrangement can work for extended period if both of us act rationally rather than allowing emotions to dictate our behaviors. The response that Kofi provided after long silence, during which he studied Marcus with eyes that revealed both intelligence and carefully controlled anger, reflected his understanding of power dynamics involved in this conversation and his recognition that overt defiance at this initial stage would accomplish nothing except to invite immediate brutal punishment that would establish precedent for future interactions, and that would demonstrate Marcus's talk about proportionate discipline had limits that would be enforced through overwhelming violence if necessary to maintain control. I understand what you are proposing. I also understand that you purchased me because you believe you can extract more value from my labor than 6 previous owners managed to extract, despite their eventual decisions to sell me rather than continue dealing with anxieties my presence created. I will work according to reasonable expectations. I will not deliberately damage property or attack personnel. I will not organize resistance among other workers, but I want you to understand something that previous owners never grasped, despite opportunities they had to learn this lesson. You do not own what makes me myself. You own my labor, and you own my physical presence at this plantation, because legal systems constructed by white people give you that ownership, despite its obvious injustice and despite its violation of principles that white people claim to value when discussing their own rights and their own freedom. But you do not own my thoughts, you do not own my will. You do not own my spirit or my identity, as Kofi of the Ashanti people regardless of what name you choose to call me. Those aspects of my being remain mine regardless of what papers say about my legal status. The day you forget this distinction, or the day you attempt to break what cannot be owned, is the day that arrangement you propose will end and consequences will follow that you cannot predict and cannot control through methods you typically employ to manage enslaved workers whose physical capabilities make your authority appear natural rather than contingent on their psychological submission to system that has no moral legitimacy despite its legal sanction. The 11 years that followed this initial exchange, September 1852 through August 1863, involved Marcus attempting to maintain precarious balance between extracting maximum possible labor from worker whose physical capabilities exceeded those of any other enslaved person at Riverside, while managing psychological relationship with someone whose intelligence, whose dignity, and whose barely suppressed rage represented constant potential threat to plantation stability and to Marcus's own physical safety if circumstances ever shifted sufficiently to allow Kofi to employ his strength toward resistance rather than toward cotton cultivation that generated Marcus's wealth and that sustained his family's comfortable lifestyle and their position within Mississippi's planter aristocracy, whose social and political dominance he derived entirely from profits extracted through exploitation of enslaved labor. The work assignments that Marcus Thornton developed for Kofi during 11 years, between September 1852 and August 1863, reflected systematic attempt to extract maximum economic value from worker whose physical capabilities exceeded those of any other enslaved person at Riverside, while simultaneously managing psychological relationship with someone whose strength and intelligence made him potentially dangerous if circumstances ever provoked him to resistance rather than to submission that slavery demanded. The labor quotas that Marcus established for Kofi were calibrated to his extraordinary capabilities. He was expected to perform work equivalent to approximately 3 normal field workers, quotas that reflected recognition that his size and strength allowed him to accomplish tasks that would require teams of people under conventional plantation operations. The cotton picking during harvest season that dominated plantation calendar from late summer through early winter involved Kofi being assigned rows significantly longer than those assigned to other workers, rows whose length reflected calculations about how much cotton one person of his capabilities could harvest during working day, extending from dawn until darkness made continued work impossible without artificial lighting that plantation operations typically did not provide. The physical tasks beyond routine cotton cultivation that Marcus assigned to Kofi included clearing new fields of trees and stumps, whose removal would have required teams of workers using specialized equipment, if not for availability of someone whose strength allowed him to accomplish alone what normally required collective labor. The process of clearing virgin forest involved felling trees using axes and saws, then removing stumps whose root systems extended deep into Mississippi Delta soil, and whose extraction typically required combination of digging, cutting, pulling with teams of mules or oxen, and sometimes burning to weaken root structures before final removal could be accomplished. But Kofi could uproot stumps through direct physical force, wrapping chains around exposed roots and pulling with strength that exceeded what draft animals could generate, leveraging his weight and his musculature to extract obstacles that would have resisted conventional removal methods. The spectacle of watching him perform these extraordinary feats created mixture of awe and anxiety among white overseers and among other enslaved workers, who recognized that physical capabilities being directed toward productive labor could just as easily be directed toward destruction if Kofi ever decided to stop cooperating with system that kept him enslaved. The cotton bales that represented final product of Riverside's agricultural operations weighed approximately 500 pounds each when properly compressed and baled for transport to market, weight that normally required 2 or 3 workers using mechanical assistance to move from storage areas to wagons that would transport them to riverboats or to railroad depots where they would begin journey to cotton exchanges in New Orleans or Memphis. But Kofi could lift and carry these bales individually without assistance, could load wagons at rates that exceeded what teams of workers could accomplish, could unload at destinations with similar efficiency that made his labor extraordinarily valuable despite anxieties his presence created. The economic calculation that Marcus made involved recognizing that Kofi's productivity more than justified premium price paid for his purchase and more than compensated for additional food costs required to maintain his strength. Standard ration allocations for field workers provided approximately 3,000 calories daily through combinations of cornmeal, salt pork, and occasional vegetables. But Kofi required approximately double this amount to maintain body weight and to sustain work capacity that generated exceptional profits. But the psychological management of relationship between Marcus and Kofi involved complexities that transcended simple economic calculations about labor productivity and food costs. The whippings that Marcus occasionally authorized for infractions that Kofi committed, working too slowly according to overseers' subjective judgment, speaking disrespectfully to white supervisor who had insulted him first, failing to show sufficient deference during interactions where white people expected enslaved people to demonstrate submission through lowered eyes and deferential language. These punishments were always administered with visible reluctance by overseers who understood that striking someone of Kofi's size carried risks that did not exist when punishing workers whose physical capabilities posed no threat to white men's safety during administration of discipline that might provoke resistance if pain or humiliation exceeded victims' capacity to endure without fighting back. The specific overseer responsible for direct supervision of Kofi's work during most of 11-year period was man named Jacob Wilson, 34 years old in 1852 when Kofi arrived at Riverside, former field worker himself, who had demonstrated aptitude for management and who had been promoted to supervisory position that allowed him to exercise authority over other enslaved people while remaining subordinate to Marcus and to plantation management hierarchy that ultimately determined all significant operational decisions. The relationship that developed between Jacob and Kofi involved constant negotiation about boundaries of acceptable behavior and about enforcement mechanisms that would maintain discipline necessary for plantation operations while avoiding provocations that might trigger resistance from someone whose physical strength made violent confrontations potentially catastrophic for white personnel who believed their authority derived from natural superiority rather than from legal and military power that could be overwhelmed if enslaved people ever collectively decided to employ their capabilities toward liberation rather than toward submission. The incidents that occurred periodically throughout 11 years between 1852 and 1863 involved moments when tensions between Jacob and Kofi escalated toward violence before being diffused through combinations of threats, negotiations, and strategic retreats by both parties, who recognized that direct confrontation carried risks neither wanted to face. One particularly dangerous incident occurred in 1856 when Jacob had ordered Kofi to perform tasks during period when Kofi was already exhausted from previous days' labor that had exceeded even extraordinary quotas normally assigned to him. The refusal that Kofi had expressed, simply saying, "I cannot do this today, I need rest," had been met with Jacob's insistence that he had no authority to determine his own work schedule, and that orders from overseers required immediate compliance regardless of personal preferences or physical condition. The standoff that developed involved Jacob reaching for whip, while Kofi stood motionless, refusing to move toward assignment that had been designated. Standoff that attracted attention of other enslaved workers, who stopped their own labor to watch confrontation, whose outcome would establish precedent about limits of Kofi's submission and limits of Jacob's authority. The resolution had come not through violence, but through intervention of Marcus himself, who had been summoned by another overseer, who recognized that situation was becoming dangerous, and who understood that plantation owners' direct involvement might diffuse tensions in ways that Jacob acting alone could not accomplish. Marcus's arrival at field where confrontation was developing had changed dynamics immediately. His authority exceeded Jacob's in ways that everyone recognized, and his willingness to negotiate, rather than simply demanding compliance through threat of violence, had provided face-saving resolution, where Kofi agreed to complete assigned task the following day, after receiving full day of rest that Marcus authorized, despite economic costs of having extraordinarily productive worker idle for 24 hours. The incident had established pattern where Marcus's personal intervention became mechanism for managing situations where Jacob's authority proved insufficient to secure Kofi's cooperation without risking violence that plantation management wanted to avoid. But the 11 years of relative stability, relative meaning that Kofi continued working without overt resistance, serious enough to threaten plantation operations or to require Marcus selling him as previous owners had done, ended abruptly during summer of 1863, when combination of factors including Civil War's progression through Mississippi, increasing opportunities for enslaved people to escape to Union lines and achieve freedom, and specific incident involving Jacob Wilson's attempt to administer punishment for minor infraction, created circumstances that triggered confrontation neither Marcus nor Jacob had anticipated and neither could control once Kofi decided that arrangement established in September 1852 had been violated in ways that released him from obligations he had accepted when agreeing to work according to Marcus's expectations in exchange for treatment that recognized his humanity, despite legal fictions denying that recognition. The broader context during summer of 1863 involved Union forces advancing through Mississippi following successful siege of Vicksburg that had concluded on July 4th with Confederate surrender of strategically crucial river port, whose loss effectively severed Confederacy in half and opened Mississippi River to Union control. The military situation created opportunities for enslaved people throughout region to escape to Union lines, where military policy announced through Emancipation Proclamation meant that refugees from slavery would be treated as free people rather than as contraband property that might be returned to white owners claiming legal ownership. The communications that circulated through enslaved networks at Riverside and throughout surrounding plantations included information about routes toward Union positions, about assistance that might be available from people along those routes, and about possibilities for new lives as free people, despite enormous uncertainties and dangers involved in attempting escape from plantations, where white owners and Confederate military forces maintained security systems designed specifically to prevent such escapes. The specific incident that occurred on August 3, 1863, began as routine interaction between Jacob Wilson and Kofi during mid-afternoon of day, when cotton cultivation required weeding and maintenance work in fields where plants were growing but had not yet reached stage where harvesting would begin. The infraction that Jacob identified involved Kofi allegedly working too slowly, according to standards that Jacob claimed reflected reasonable expectations for someone of Kofi's capabilities, but that Kofi understood represented arbitrary harassment designed to assert authority that Jacob felt was being challenged by general atmosphere of potential resistance created by news of Union victories and possibilities of escape that were circulating through the enslaved population at Riverside. The verbal exchange that began confrontation involved Jacob criticizing Kofi's work pace and ordering him to increase speed to meet quotas that Jacob specified, orders that Kofi responded to by continuing work at same pace while stating calmly that he was working as quickly as conditions allowed and that Jacob's expectations exceeded what was reasonable, even accounting for his extraordinary physical capabilities. The escalation from verbal exchange to physical confrontation began when Jacob decided that Kofi's response constituted insubordination, requiring punishment beyond simple verbal reprimand, decision that reflected Jacob's recognition that other enslaved workers were observing interaction and that allowing Kofi to challenge his authority without consequences might encourage broader resistance that would undermine discipline necessary for plantation operations during period when military situation was creating opportunities for escape and when enslaved people's calculations about risks and benefits of submission versus resistance were shifting in ways that threatened entire system that slavery depended on. The order that Jacob gave, "Remove your shirt and come here for correction," was delivered in voice loud enough to carry across field where approximately 40 workers were laboring and where everyone immediately understood that public whipping was about to occur unless Kofi submitted to punishment or unless someone intervened to prevent confrontation that was developing. The refusal that Kofi expressed, simply standing motionless and saying no in voice, that combined perfect calm with absolute finality, represented violation of slavery's fundamental requirement that enslaved people submit to white authority regardless of how arbitrary or unjust that authority's exercise might be. The single word spoken clearly and firmly constituted open defiance of social order that governed plantation life, defiance that required immediate response from Jacob, who could not allow such resistance to stand without completely undermining his authority over other enslaved workers who were watching confrontation and who would draw conclusions about limits of white power based on whether Jacob could successfully enforce compliance or whether Kofi's refusal would be allowed to establish precedent that resistance was possible without catastrophic consequence. The moment when Jacob reached for whip that hung from his belt, leather whip approximately 4 feet in length, whose construction included braided strands designed to maximize pain while theoretically minimizing permanent damage to enslaved workers whose economic value plantation owners wanted to preserve despite need to maintain discipline through physical punishment, represented point where confrontation transitioned from verbal exchange to physical violence, whose outcome would be determined by relative capabilities of two men whose strength, skill, and determination would be tested through combat that neither had specifically wanted but that both recognized was now unavoidable given social dynamics, requiring that white authority be maintained through violence if submission could not be secured through psychological dominance alone. But before Jacob could complete motion of raising whip, and before he could deliver first strike that would have initiated punishment he intended to administer, Kofi moved with speed that seemed impossible for someone of his size. His right hand shot forward and grabbed whip's handle before Jacob could complete upward swing. His grip wrenched weapon from Jacob's grasp with force that pulled overseer off balance and forward into Kofi's waiting left hand, which closed around Jacob's throat with pressure that immediately cut off his breathing and that lifted him completely off ground, so that his feet dangled helplessly while he struggled ineffectively against grip, whose strength exceeded anything that normal human being could generate through muscle power alone. Kofi's lightning-fast response that left a white overseer dangling helplessly. As you desperate to know how this exploded into full rebellion, subscribe and comment about resistance that broke slavery's illusion of absolute white control. The seconds during which Jacob Wilson dangled helplessly in Kofi's grip, feet kicking uselessly as he tried to find purchase on ground that remained inches below his suspended body, hands clawing desperately at fingers wrapped around his throat with pressure, that was steadily increasing toward levels that would crush his windpipe and end his life within moments if Kofi chose to complete what he had begun. Stretched into eternity for 40 enslaved workers who had stopped their own labor entirely to watch confrontation, whose outcome would determine whether slavery's claims to absolute white authority could be maintained through judge violence, or whether those claims would be revealed as depending ultimately on enslaved people's psychological submission, rather than on any genuine physical superiority that white supremacy insisted derived from natural racial hierarchy ordained by God and confirmed by history. The tableau that existed during those suspended moments, massive enslaved man holding white overseer above ground, with single hand while crowd watched in mixture of terror and fascination, represented visual refutation of every ideological claim that slavery used to justify itself, demonstrated with perfect clarity that power dynamics governing plantation life depended not on white people's inherent superiority, but rather on complex systems of psychological control, legal sanctions, and ultimate recourse to overwhelming military force that could be deployed if individual acts of resistance threatened to spread into general rebellion that slavery's defenders had always feared as existential threat to entire economic and social order built on exploitation of enslaved labor. The moment when Kofi finally released his grip and allowed Jacob to collapse gasping onto ground, where he lay coughing and clutching at throat, whose bruising would be visible for weeks afterward, came not because Kofi feared consequences of killing overseer, whose death would certainly result in his own execution, through hanging or through even more brutal methods designed to terrorize other enslaved people into continued submission. His decision release, rather than kill reflected calculation that Jacob's death would accomplish nothing except to guarantee his own death without creating any meaningful change in system that would simply replace dead overseer with new one and would replace executed resistant worker with newly purchased enslaved person whose compliance would be secured through enhanced surveillance and enhanced violence designed to prevent recurrence of resistance that had temporarily disrupted plantation operations. The strategic thinking that informed Kofi's decision during those crucial seconds demonstrated intelligence and capacity for rational calculation under extreme pressure that contradicted every stereotype about enslaved people, supposedly lacking mental capabilities for complex reasoning about long-term consequences of immediate actions. The aftermath of Kofi releasing Jacob involved immediate pandemonium, as other white overseers who had been summoned by workers sent running when confrontation began, arrived at scene and confronted situation where enslaved person had physically attacked white supervisor, had literally held his life in hands for extended moment before choosing to release rather than kill, but where attack itself represented violation of slavery's fundamental rules, requiring absolute submission to white authority regardless of circumstances and regardless of how unjust that authority's exercise might be. The debate that occurred among white overseers about immediate response, whether to attempt to restrain Kofi through collective action that would involve multiple white men attacking simultaneously, whether to summon Marcus Thornton to make decision about how situation should be handled, whether to organize armed response involving weapons that would allow them to kill Kofi from distance if he resisted efforts to restrain him. This debate occurred while Kofi stood calmly watching, and while 40 enslaved witnesses remained frozen in positions they had occupied when violence had erupted, everyone understanding that next few minutes would determine whether confrontation would escalate into bloodshed or whether some resolution could be negotiated that would allow plantation operations to resume. The decision that white overseers reached after several minutes of urgent discussion was to send one overseer to summon Marcus, while others maintained defensive positions around Kofi without actually attempting to restrain him physically, because none wanted to risk being first to attack someone whose response to Jacob's whipping attempt had demonstrated both his willingness to employ violence and his capability to inflict serious harm or death on anyone who threatened him. The waiting period during which Marcus was being located and brought to field stretched across approximately 20 minutes, during which no one moved and no one spoke. 20 minutes of silence, broken only by Jacob's continued coughing and gasping as he slowly recovered capacity to breathe normally, while remaining seated on ground where he had collapsed after Kofi released him. The arrival of Marcus Thornton at field where confrontation had occurred brought plantation owner, who understood immediately upon observing scene, Jacob sitting on ground with visible bruises developing on his throat, Kofi standing calmly surrounded by cautious overseers, maintaining distance, 40 enslaved workers watching in complete silence. That situation he had attempted to avoid for 11 years through careful management had finally materialized, despite all his efforts to maintain balance between extracting productive labor and avoiding provocations that might trigger resistance from someone whose physical capabilities made violent confrontation potentially catastrophic. The conversation that Marcus initiated with Kofi occurred with all parties maintaining positions they had occupied when Marcus arrived. Conversation conducted across approximately 10 feet of distance that Marcus maintained as buffer against possibility that Kofi might attack him as he had attacked Jacob, if provoked by words or tone that challenged his dignity or that demanded submission he was no longer willing to provide. "Explain what happened here," Marcus began, directing his words toward Kofi, rather than toward Jacob, whose version of events Marcus could obtain later in private, where Jacob's inevitable emphasis on his own authority and his minimization of any provocations he might have committed could be assessed without audience of enslaved workers, who would judge whether Master's response validated their authority or revealed vulnerabilities in system that claimed absolute control. The request for Kofi's account represented strategic choice by Marcus. By asking rather than simply accepting Jacob's version or simply ordering Kofi's immediate punishment, Marcus created space for negotiation that might diffuse immediate crisis, while postponing final resolution until circumstances allowed for more careful consideration of options and consequences. Kofi's response came after a brief pause, during which he appeared to be organizing thoughts about how to explain confrontation in ways that would communicate essential information without expressing defiance so overtly that Marcus would be forced to respond with violence merely to maintain appearance of authority before enslaved witnesses whose observations would circulate throughout plantation and throughout region via communication networks. Connie. Acting enslaved people across property boundaries that white people imagined were absolute, but that actually remained permeable to information flows that slavery could never completely suppress. Jacob ordered me to submit to whipping for working too slowly, according to his judgment. I refused because pace I was maintaining represented maximum sustainable rate, given conditions, and given fact that I have been working without adequate rest for previous 3 days, while performing labor equivalent to 3 normal workers. Jacob attempted to strike me with whip. I prevented this by taking whip from his hand. He then attempted to retrieve whip by physical force. I prevented this by restraining him temporarily until he ceased struggling. I then released him unharmed except for bruises resulting from being held rather than from being struck. That is complete account of what occurred. The factual tone that Kofi employed, avoiding emotional language or explicit challenges to white authority, while nevertheless asserting his right to refuse punishment he considered unjust, created dilemma for Marcus, who needed to maintain slavery's requirement of absolute submission, while also recognizing that attempting to punish Kofi for refusing unjust whipping might provoke resistance that would result in deaths of white personnel or might inspire broader resistance among enslaved workers who were already calculating whether changed military circumstances created opportunities to escape toward Union lines where freedom could be achieved, despite slavery's insistence that such freedom was impossible. The decision that Marcus needed to make involved choosing between demonstrating authority through violence that might escalate uncontrollably and accepting temporary compromise that would preserve order while postponing confrontation until circumstances might be more favorable for reasserting control without risking catastrophic violence. "Return to quarters," Marcus finally said after extended silence, during which everyone present understood he was weighing options and calculating consequences. "Remain there until I decide how to address what has occurred. Jacob, you will also return to your quarters to recover. Other overseers will supervise remaining work for today. All enslaved workers will resume normal duties immediately and will not discuss what has occurred here, except as I specifically authorize such discussion." The resolution that Marcus announced represented temporary deferral rather than actual decision about consequences, but temporary deferral created time for Kofi to implement plans that he had been developing since hearing about Union victories that created realistic possibilities for escape that had not existed during previous years when Confederate military control throughout Mississippi made attempts to reach Union lines virtually suicidal, and when recapture would have resulted in brutal punishment or death designed to deter others from attempting similar escapes. The return to quarters that Marcus had ordered provided Kofi with opportunity to gather minimal supplies and to finalize escape plans that involved traveling by night toward Union positions near Vicksburg, where he had heard through enslaved communication networks that refugees from slavery were being accepted and were being provided with status as free people rather than being returned to white owners claiming legal ownership despite emancipatio and proclamation that had theoretically ended slavery in Confederate territories. The escape that Kofi executed on night of August 3, 1863, leaving Riverside Plantation approximately 3 hours after sunset, when darkness provided cover and when white supervision of enslaved quarters diminished because plantation management assumed that enslaved people would remain in designated areas during nighttime hours, involved traveling alone through approximately 80 miles of territory, where Confederate military forces and civilian patrols maintained security designed specifically to prevent enslaved people from escaping toward Union lines. The route that he followed utilized knowledge of Mississippi geography that he had accumulated through years of experience and through information shared by other enslaved people about safe paths, about locations where assistance might be available from people sympathetic to refugees, about timing that would allow him to cover maximum distance during darkness, while finding concealment during daylight hours, when travel would have exposed him to observation by white patrols whose capture of escaping enslaved people represented lucrative bounty income, supplementing their normal economic activities. The journey that extended across 5 nights of travel and 4 days of concealment in swamps and forests, where pursuit would be difficult, involved Kofi covering approximately 15 to 20 miles per night, depending on terrain and on presence of patrols whose routes he needed to avoid. The physical capabilities that had made him extraordinarily valuable as enslaved worker now made him formidable as fugitive. His strength allowed him to travel through terrain that would have stopped or slowed other refugees. His size initially appeared to be liability that would make concealment difficult, but actually provided advantages because his capacity to move through dense vegetation and through water obstacles that would have required other fugitives to seek alternate routes allowed him to maintain paths that pursuers were less likely to monitor. The endurance that allowed him to work 18-hour days during cotton harvest now allowed him to maintain steady pace throughout nights while surviving on minimal food that he had carried or that he obtained through foraging as he traveled. The arrival at Union lines near Vicksburg on August 8, 1863, 5 days after escaping from Riverside Plantation, and after covering approximately 80 miles through territory controlled by Confederate forces who maintained active patrols specifically to prevent enslaved people from reaching Union positions, involved Kofi approaching sentries who initially raised weapons before recognizing that man approaching their positions was refugee seeking asylum rather than Confederate scout or irregular forces attempting infiltration. The interrogation that followed his arrival involved Union officers attempting to determine his status, his origins, his knowledge about Confederate positions and movements, and his intentions regarding what he hoped to accomplish by escaping to Union lines. The information that Kofi provided during these interrogations, including details about Riverside Plantation's operations, about Confederate military movements he had observed, about conditions among enslaved people throughout region who were calculating whether to attempt escape, proved valuable enough that Union forces provided him with employment as scout, whose knowledge of local geography and whose physical capabilities made him useful for reconnaissance missions that regular Union soldiers would have struggled to perform. The transformation from enslaved worker to free man, employed by Union Army, occurred formally during weeks following his arrival as military bureaucracy processed documentation establishing his status as person whose legal freedom had been secured through Emancipation Proclamation, despite that proclamation's limitations and despite ongoing debates about whether enslaved people from Confederate territories should be considered legally free or should be treated as contraband, whose status remained ambiguous until final resolution of Civil War's outcome. The practical reality that mattered more than legal formalities involved Kofi working according to terms he negotiated rather than being forced to work according to quotas imposed by owners claiming legal authority, being paid wages for his labor rather than receiving only minimal food and shelter, that slavery provided, while extracting all economic value generated through enslaved people's productive capacity, and most fundamentally, being recognized as person whose will and whose choices deserved respect, rather than being treated as property, whose preferences and whose desires had no moral or legal significance. The impact of Kofi's escape on Riverside Plantation and on Marcus Thornton's operations involved both immediate disruption from loss of extraordinarily productive worker whose labor had generated profits far exceeding those produced by any other enslaved person, and longer-term symbolic significance, a story of his resistance and his successful escape, circulated through enslaved communities throughout Mississippi. The gap in labor capacity that his departure created could not be filled through redistributing his impossible work quotas among remaining workers whose physical capabilities could not match his extraordinary strength and endurance. The example that his resistance and escape provided to other enslaved people at Riverside and throughout region involved demonstration that white authority was not absolute despite slavery's claims, that resistance was possible even against overseers carrying whips, that escape was achievable even through territory controlled by Confederate forces, and that freedom was not merely theoretical possibility, but actual achievable outcome for people willing to risk dangers involved in attempting journey toward Union lines. The years following Kofi's arrival at Union lines near Vicksburg on August 8, 1863, involved transformation from fugitive, whose legal status remained technically ambiguous under Emancipation Proclamation's complex provisions, to recognized free man, whose service to Union military effort provided both immediate employment and long-term pathway toward establishing new life as person, whose choices and whose labor belonged to himself, rather than to owners claiming authority through legal systems that civil war was in process of destroying despite ongoing resistance from Confederacy, whose military forces continued fighting to preserve slavery system, that Kofi's escape and the escapes of hundreds of thousands of other enslaved people were systematically undermining through withdrawing their labor from plantation economies that depended on coerced work to generate wealth that sustained white planter aristocracy's political and social dominance throughout South. The employment that Union forces provided to Kofi reflected recognition that his extraordinary physical capabilities, combined with his knowledge of local geography and his intelligence about military movements and Confederate positions, made him valuable asset whose contributions to Union war effort justified compensation at rates exceeding those paid to ordinary laborers or soldiers whose service was valued but whose individual capabilities did not distinguish them from thousands of other people performing similar functions. The specific work that Kofi performed during final 2 years of Civil War involved combination of scout duties, where his knowledge of Mississippi terrain and his physical capabilities allowed him to conduct reconnaissance missions through territory where regular Union soldiers would have been more easily detected or would have struggled to move efficiently through swamps and forests that characterized much of region's landscape, and labor on fortifications and supply infrastructure, where his strength allowed him to accomplish tasks that would have required teams of workers if performed by people of normal physical capabilities. The wages that he earned through this employment, approximately $20 monthly plus rations and equipment, represented first time in his life that compensation for labor was paid directly to him, rather than being retained by owners who claimed legal right to all economic value generated through enslaved people's productive capacity, regardless of how much wealth that capacity created for people who contributed nothing except capital to perk. Hayes enslaved workers and land to employ them on. The accumulation of savings that resulted from receiving wages, rather than merely receiving subsistence provisions that slavery provided, involved Kofi beginning to build financial resources that would allow him to establish independent life after war's conclusion, rather than being forced into economic arrangements that would reproduce many of slavery's worst features, despite formal legal emancipation. The discussions that occurred among formerly enslaved people working for Union forces involved collective recognition that legal freedom would be meaningless if economic conditions forced them into debt peonage or sharecropping arrangements where landowners would extract maximum value from their labor, while providing minimal compensation that would keep them permanently impoverished and permanently dependent on white people who controlled land and capital necessary for agricultural production that remained primary economic activity throughout South, even after slavery's formal elimination. The military service that Kofi performed involved him witnessing final stages of Civil War's conclusion, including Sherman's march through Georgia and Carolinas during late 1864 and early 1865, where Union forces systematically destroyed Confederate infrastructure and liberated tens of thousands of enslaved people, whose withdrawal from plantation labor further undermined Confederacy's capacity to sustain military resistance against Union forces. Those numerical and material superiority was becoming overwhelming as war extended into its fourth year. The participation in these campaigns provided Kofi with first-hand observation of slavery's collapse as social and economic system, the abandoned plantations where white owners had fled before advancing Union forces, the crowds of formerly enslaved people following Union armies, seeking protection and seeking opportunities to establish new lives as free people, the destruction of wealth and power that had appeared permanent and unshakable only few years earlier, when Confederate secession had seemed to guarantee slavery's continuation and expansion into Western territories that Civil War's outcome would now determine would be organized as free states rather than as slave states, extending system that Kofi and millions of other enslaved people had experienced as systematic violence and systematic denial of humanity. The transition from wartime military service to peacetime civilian life occurred during months following Confederate surrender in April 1865, when Union forces began demobilizing and when formerly enslaved people throughout South confronted questions about how to build lives as free people in contexts where white Southerners who had supported Confederacy retained control of most land and most capital despite their military defeat and despite form. Elimination of slavery through 13th Amendment's ratification in December 1865. The choices that Kofi made during this transition period reflected understanding that returning to Mississippi, where he had been enslaved, would expose him to violence from former masters or from white vigilantes who were beginning to organize campaigns of terror designed to reassert white supremacy despite slavery's formal elimination, and reflected decision to relocate to Ohio, where communities of free black people had existed before Civil War and where opportunities for employment and for social integration appeared better than in former Confederate states where racial violence was becoming endemic, as white Southerners attempted to recreate slavery's essential features through black codes and through extra-legal terror that federal Reconstruction policies attempted to suppress, but that continued despite military occupation and despite constitutional amendments guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under law. The settlement in Cincinnati that Kofi chose as permanent residence involved him joining community of approximately 15,000 black people, whose population had grown significantly during and after Civil War as formerly enslaved people migrated northward seeking safety and seeking economic opportunities that South's ongoing racial violence made inaccessible despite formal legal protections that federal government attempted to enforce through military occupation and through Freedmen's Bureau operations that provided assistance but that could not fundamentally transform economic and social structures that concentrated wealth and power in hands of white people who had benefited from slavery and who were determined to maintain racial hierarchy despite slavery's formal elimination. The employment that Kofi found in Cincinnati involved initially working as laborer on construction projects, where his extraordinary strength made him valuable worker whose productivity exceeded that of other laborers, work that paid wages, allowing him to rent housing and to begin establishing stable life as free person whose choices about where to live and where to work and how to spend earnings belonged to himself rather than to owners claiming authority to make all such decisions. The family that Kofi eventually established involved him marrying a woman named Sarah, who had also been enslaved in Mississippi and who had escaped to Union lines during similar time frame as his own escape, marriage that occurred in 1867 and that produced 5 children.